so many countries, nations are recognizing Palestine as a state. Just recently, we've seen that. Also, we've seen that Netanyahu is very reluctant on continuing the war, right? Because there had been rumors that one of the reasons why they went after Iran was to deflect some sort of agreement that was about to happen with Gaza. So just to deflect that, they started a war with Iran. Does that hold any credibility?
This is when I continue with that, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I mean, that's so obvious in this case also. But, this increasing recognition in Europe of the Palestinian state. Spain, for instance, is, I think, the most aggressive on this. Yes. And Trump has called for expelling Spain from NATO for this reason. Okay. And so the question is, like you say, this is an unresolved thing. Howsoever nice that the slaughter has at least temporarily scaled down, shall we say, not even ended, what does this tension in Europe with the American position mean in the future? Because in Europe, the pro-Palestine movement is very, very strong. And we see pictures of British police actually clubbing, throwing, 80-year-old protesters on the mat, and handcuffing them and all that. What is shocking to people in Nepal and, in this part of the world is, that was supposed to be the epitome of free speech and democracy and all that. So what is happening, and what will happen to this transatlantic alliance?
Okay, that's a series of questions.
One more.
Rolled into I think you're going to get bombarded with questions.
It's like we're interrogating him.
Okay,
on the same context, right?
Yeah.
Don't you see this thing as a collapse of democracy as we know it? Because it's 75 countries voting against few, like right. If democracy was so important, then they should have listened to this voice. Because so where is that belief that we decide in a majority and that we'll all accommodate with our boundaries, right? That was the thought of democracy. But what empire is doing right now is they themselves are assassinating this narrative, right?
Yes, I think that this is a lot of questions rolled into one. But I think behind what you're saying is we're seeing the end or the ending and the troubled ending of the post-war international order. The whole structure of the United Nations was the idea that sovereign nations, including independent countries that had been colonies before, would come together in some sort of global assembly. They would form a sort of global government with the equivalent of the State Department, or if you like, as the UN Security Council, which included the 5 major powers as they were at the end of the war. And I think we're seeing the end of an international rules-based order that has been essentially dominated in the post-war period by the United States. And we're seeing the end of that. So now suddenly, instead of the United States being seen, at least in the West, we'll come back to what the West means in a moment, as the world's policeman, major intervening in order to maintain law and order, we're seeing the end of that, where the vast majority of independent countries have voted in one way at the UN General Assembly, with only a few countries, particularly the US and Israel, in this particular context, voting against. Now, the fact that the 5 countries of the United Nations Security Council, each one has a veto, means that one vote, and it's usually 2 if it's America and Israel at the moment, can stop and block the vast majority. So this is the breakdown of the United Nations as a a global force, I think. And we've seen that although the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has constantly been calling on for peace and reconciliation, the UN has actually had no significant role in this crisis in Israel and Gaza at all. There was a presence of United Nations troops in Lebanon to try and maintain the peace. They proved incredibly ineffective. They were unable to do anything against the Israelis, who actually attacked on occasion the United Nations troops. So, in a sense, we're seeing the end of a global order and the beginnings of something new. You might call it a new disorder or the beginnings of a new world, and I think we can talk about that. But it's certainly the breakdown of a consensus that existed for many decades about how international law, international rules, and so on should be respected. Now, if you come back to the recognition of Palestine again, before this particular period of crisis, the last 2 years, I think over 100, I can't remember, countries had formally recognized Palestine and so on, and it had some observer status at the United Nations. But Europe, the European countries by and large, had refused to recognize Palestine. And they were caught in a dilemma as over 2 years it became more and more obvious that Israel had entirely overreached, some response to the October 7th invasion or intervention by Hamas was probably legitimate, but, it had gone far beyond that. The European governments were put in the position increasingly, with, as you say, increasing support for Palestine among the populations, put in a very difficult position, and they resisted and resisted and resisted to the last minute. And those of us in Britain who have been not pro-Palestine, but in favour of a cessation of this slaughter, have been trying to put pressure on our government for a long time, many, many, many months. And the Labour government was very reluctant to agree to this. So it's only very recently, in the last few months, that suddenly a wave of governments in Europe have kind of gone along with the general mood of their own populations and have formally, officially recognised Palestine. But since Palestine doesn't exist as a reality, it's a kind of token. Now, from Netanyahu and the Israeli government's point of view, this was threatening, this was worrying. Mm-hmm. From the United States and from Trump's point of view, this was very negative. He was very unhappy about this. It sort of undermined all of his initiatives. So it's a gesture. And in my view, I'm afraid no more than a gesture. Mm-hmm. And throughout this, certainly my own government has been supplying bullets and arms to Israel. It's supported Israel right through. Our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has said, I am a Zionist and proud to be one. Almost every member of the Labour government has echoed that. There's the most extraordinary elision or confusion between being a Zionist or being an anti-Zionist and being anti-Semitic. Yeah. So anti-Semitic is, a hatred of Jews as people. And I, like many people, think this is about anti-racist. I deplore that. But Zionism is a particular political movement. And as I said, it was very influential in the Balfour Declaration. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's a lobbying group. It's a political belief that the Jews have a right to not just a homeland, but a state, and a Jewish state at that. And it's a very aggressive and probably expansionist philosophy. So the whole of the movement towards recognizing Palestine is a sort of feeble, in my view, gesture on the part of Western governments to do the right thing. But politically, I think at the moment, it really has very little significance. Okay. What to me is significant is the situation on the ground. Situation on the ground is we have a very loosely framed set of ideas about what a ceasefire and the next few moves will be. And in a way, because it's so loose, it allows people to interpret it in different ways. But in my view, as I say, to go back to the fundamentals, the Israeli government has said there will be no Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. Hamas retains the right to maintain its weapons. And the resistance from within the Palestinian population will continue. There's no doubt. It may take new forms. It may be, forms of political disobedience, guerrilla warfare. All sorts of things are possible. Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, is incredibly precarious. And people don't realize this. It's enormously well armed, very powerful. It's been slaughtering people for 2 years with virtually no opposition. But it is very precarious. It's a very tiny territory. If you look at the area, it's very small indeed. And its population are very vulnerable economically as well as politically. That's very little seen because for many decades now, the US has provided it with enormous funds and support, not just military support, but financial support, and it's underwritten this tiny state, which is very vulnerable.
Yeah, and this, it's interesting because, this Trumpian ceasefire, welcome as it is, anything that prevents slaughter at this scale is welcome, that's true. But still doesn't solve the underlying problem, as you say, A bit like what's happening in Nepal right now, right? Major transition or a rupture, but hasn't solved the underlying contradictions politically and all. But what is interesting here is, this Netanyahu's attempt to drag the U.S. into a bigger war by attacking Iran. Okay. But what the attack of Iran showed, now from the stuff that we read outside of the, the CNN, BBC narratives and all, is that apparently Iran has, despite all the sanctions, really developed militarily with all their, drones and missiles and all that. And in that attack, when Iran responded, it turned out that the so-called Iron Dome of Israel was useless. In fact, the Houthis had already shown that to some extent. Now, what you mentioned, it's a very small piece of real estate, Israel. Yeah. It has no strategic depth. Yeah. And so, it's not, if somebody really wanted to bomb Israel, whether it's the Houthis or the Iranians, Israel would be completely, Gaza would be all over Israel.
Except the one thing that Israel, you have to remember, is also a nuclear power.
Yes, it's got...
Israel has never recognized or accepted that it is, but the reality
there is something there in Dimona.
It's very well known that it is a nuclear power, and they have never ruled out what they call the Samson option. And the Samson, if you remember the Bible... Those of you who have ever read the Bible, it's an excellent book. I recommend it greatly. He was an Israelite who was captured by the Philistines, the Palestinians, and he was held as a prisoner in Gaza. I mean, the irony of this is amazing. And he pulled the temple in, such was his strength. He pulled the temple in on himself and all of the Philistines. Israel has always maintained that at the last resort they could use nuclear weapons. And Iran has not got nuclear weapons. Both the US and Israel have constantly insisted that they are moving towards it, they're on the edge of it, they're on the verge of it. This was part of the justification for the attack on various sites in Iran recently. All of the evidence, as I understand it, is that Iran has not nearly reached the capacity, and its own statements, you take them with a pinch of salt, its own statements are that we are interested in nuclear power, energy. We have no intention to become a nuclear weapons power. But of course, the narrative from the West, and from Israel in particular, is that we can't believe a word they say. They're the evil enemy. They're the threat to the Middle East. They're the threat that, if you like, supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, supports Hamas, and so on. Iran is evil. Therefore, the United States and Israel combined in recent months to bomb another sovereign state. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, with no repercussions. American bombers were involved. This is absolutely... No one seems to have mentioned this, once it's stopped. The fact this is an act of war in which America, United States, literally bombed another country. And Israel hoped, I think, that this would detract from attention to Gaza and so on. I think it's failed in a number of respects.